The vintage Cartier diamond ring sitting in the velvet jewelry box on my lap was worth $45,000. But the look on my mother-in-law's face when I placed the receipt for its purchase in her hands at Christmas dinner would be absolutely priceless. What Margaret Williams didn't know was that her decision to steal and sell my deceased grandmother's engagement ring had just triggered a chain of events that would expose her as a thief, cost her the respect of her entire family, and transform me from the quiet daughter-in-law she thought she could manipulate into the woman who would systematically dismantle her reputation while building a jewelry business worth over $2 million. By the time dessert was served that Christmas evening, Margaret would be fleeing her own holiday party in shame. Her son would finally see her true character, and I would have the evidence I needed to not only reclaim my family heirloom, but destroy the woman who thought she could profit from my grief. My name is Isabella Rose Martinez-Williams, and at 29 years old, I had spent the last 4 years of my marriage learning to navigate the treacherous waters of having Margaret Williams as my mother-in-law. Standing 5'5" with long dark hair that I inherited from my Spanish grandmother and brown eyes that could shift from warm to intimidating when necessary, I was the daughter of immigrants who had taught me the value of family, tradition, and standing up for what belongs to you. The ring at the center of this story wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the symbol of my family's journey from poverty in Spain to prosperity in America. My grandmother, Elena Martinez, had received the 1925 Cartier engagement ring from my grandfather Rafael when he proposed in 1947 after saving for 3 years to afford it. The ring had passed to my mother when Elena died, and then to me when my mother passed away from breast cancer 2 years into my marriage to Jonathan Williams. Jonathan was 31 years old, 6'2" with sandy brown hair and the kind of easygoing personality that made everyone like him immediately. He worked as a software engineer for a Fortune 500 company in Atlanta, earning a solid income that allowed us to live comfortably in a modest suburban home. But Jonathan's greatest weakness was his inability to stand up to his mother, a character flaw that had caused problems in our marriage from the very beginning. Margaret Williams was 57 years old, recently divorced from Jonathan's father after 28 years of marriage, and absolutely convinced that no woman would ever be good enough for her precious only child. Standing 5'8" with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of social climbing in Atlanta's upper-middle-class circles, Margaret had made it clear from our first meeting that she viewed me as a temporary inconvenience in Jonathan's life rather than his chosen partner. The stakes of what Margaret had done couldn't have been higher. The ring wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was the last tangible connection I had to my mother and grandmother, both of whom had died too young and too suddenly. My mother had given it to me on her deathbed, making me promise to pass it on to my own daughter someday. When Margaret stole and sold it, she wasn't just committing theft. She was severing my connection to my family's history and legacy. But Margaret had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that the quiet, respectful daughter-in-law who rarely challenged her would simply accept the loss of her most precious possession. What she didn't understand was that my apparent compliance had been strategic patience, and that my background in art history and jewelry appraisal gave me both the knowledge and the connections to not only track down my stolen ring, but turn the entire experience into an opportunity that would change my life forever. The discovery of the theft had come 2 weeks earlier, during what was supposed to be a routine visit to help Margaret prepare for her annual Christmas party. What I found instead was evidence of a betrayal so calculated and cruel that it would transform my relationship with my husband's family and launch the most satisfying revenge I could have ever imagined. If you've ever had something precious stolen by someone who was supposed to protect and respect you, you know the particular kind of rage that comes with realizing you've been violated by someone you trusted. Please subscribe to hear how I turned that violation into the foundation for building a business empire while serving my mother-in-law a lesson she would never forget. Now let me tell you exactly how a Christmas dinner became the setting for the most perfectly orchestrated revenge in family history. The vintage Cartier diamond ring sitting in the velvet jewelry box on my lap was worth $45,000. But the look on my mother-in-law's face when I placed the receipt for its purchase in her hands at Christmas dinner would be absolutely priceless. What Margaret Williams didn't know was that her decision to steal and sell my deceased grandmother's engagement ring had just triggered a chain of events that would expose her as a thief, cost her the respect of her entire family, and transform me from the quiet daughter-in-law she thought she could manipulate into the woman who would systematically dismantle her reputation while building a jewelry business worth over $2 million. By the time dessert was served that Christmas evening, Margaret would be fleeing her own holiday party in shame. Her son would finally see her true character, and I would have the evidence I needed to not only reclaim my family heirloom, but destroy the woman who thought she could profit from my grief. My name is Isabella Rose Martinez-Williams, and at 29 years old, I had spent the last 4 years of my marriage learning to navigate the treacherous waters of having Margaret Williams as my mother-in-law. Standing 5'5" with long dark hair that I inherited from my Spanish grandmother and brown eyes that could shift from warm to intimidating when necessary, I was the daughter of immigrants who had taught me the value of family, tradition, and standing up for what belongs to you. The ring at the center of this story wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was the symbol of my family's journey from poverty in Spain to prosperity in America. My grandmother, Elena Martinez, had received the 1925 Cartier engagement ring from my grandfather Rafael when he proposed in 1947 after saving for 3 years to afford it. The ring had passed to my mother when Elena died, and then to me when my mother passed away from breast cancer 2 years into my marriage to Jonathan Williams. Jonathan was 31 years old, 6'2" with sandy brown hair and the kind of easygoing personality that made everyone like him immediately. He worked as a software engineer for a Fortune 500 company in Atlanta, earning a solid income that allowed us to live comfortably in a modest suburban home. But Jonathan's greatest weakness was his inability to stand up to his mother, a character flaw that had caused problems in our marriage from the very beginning. Margaret Williams was 57 years old, recently divorced from Jonathan's father after 28 years of marriage, and absolutely convinced that no woman would ever be good enough for her precious only child. Standing 5'8" with perfectly highlighted blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that came from years of social climbing in Atlanta's upper-middle-class circles, Margaret had made it clear from our first meeting that she viewed me as a temporary inconvenience in Jonathan's life rather than his chosen partner. The stakes of what Margaret had done couldn't have been higher. The ring wasn't just valuable in monetary terms. It was the last tangible connection I had to my mother and grandmother, both of whom had died too young and too suddenly. My mother had given it to me on her deathbed, making me promise to pass it on to my own daughter someday. When Margaret stole and sold it, she wasn't just committing theft. She was severing my connection to my family's history and legacy. But Margaret had made a critical error in judgment. She had assumed that the quiet, respectful daughter-in-law who rarely challenged her would simply accept the loss of her most precious possession. What she didn't understand was that my apparent compliance had been strategic patience, and that my background in art history and jewelry appraisal gave me both the knowledge and the connections to not only track down my stolen ring, but turn the entire experience into an opportunity that would change my life forever. The discovery of the theft had come 2 weeks earlier, during what was supposed to be a routine visit to help Margaret prepare for her annual Christmas party. What I found instead was evidence of a betrayal so calculated and cruel that it would transform my relationship with my husband's family and launch the most satisfying revenge I could have ever imagined. If you've ever had something precious stolen by someone who was supposed to protect and respect you, you know the particular kind of rage that comes with realizing you've been violated by someone you trusted. Please subscribe to hear how I turned that violation into the foundation for building a business empire while serving my mother-in-law a lesson she would never forget. Now let me tell you exactly how a Christmas dinner became the setting for the most perfectly orchestrated revenge in family history. "I just want what's best for both of you," Margaret would say when offering unsolicited advice about our decisions. "I've learned so much over the years about what makes marriages successful, and I hate to see young couples make unnecessary mistakes." Jonathan, who had grown up with Margaret's strong opinions and directive personality, didn't seem to notice how often his mother's suggestions were actually expectations that she became upset about if we didn't follow. When I occasionally expressed concern about Margaret's tendency to involve herself in our decisions, Jonathan would dismiss my concerns as normal adjustment difficulties. "Mom just cares about us," he would say. "She's been through a divorce and she's seen what can go wrong in marriages. She's just trying to help us avoid problems." The dynamic became more complicated when Margaret's own marriage began to deteriorate in late 2020, as her relationship with Jonathan's father became increasingly strained. She began relying more heavily on Jonathan for emotional support and practical assistance. This meant more frequent visits, longer phone calls, and more involvement in the details of our daily life. During this period, Margaret's interest in my professional expertise intensified. She began asking me to appraise pieces she was considering selling as part of her divorce settlement, wanted advice about which items she should fight to keep, and sought my opinion about the auction market for various categories of antiques and jewelry. "I'm so grateful to have someone in the family who understands these things," Margaret would say when asking for my help. "David never appreciated the finer things, and I want to make sure I'm making smart decisions about what to keep and what to let go." I was happy to help, both because I genuinely enjoyed using my expertise and because I hoped that being useful to Margaret might improve our relationship and help her see me as a valuable addition to the family rather than a threat to her relationship with Jonathan. The first sign that something was wrong came in early 2022 when I noticed that Margaret had acquired several new pieces of jewelry and art that seemed expensive for someone going through a divorce. When I complimented her on a particularly stunning Art Deco bracelet, she became evasive about where she had purchased it and how much it had cost. "Oh, that's just something I picked up at an estate sale," she said dismissively. "You know how good I've gotten at finding bargains since you've been teaching me what to look for." But my professional training had taught me to recognize quality and authenticity, and the pieces Margaret was acquiring were not estate sale bargains. They were high-end items that would have cost thousands of dollars at reputable dealers or auction houses. When I mentioned my observations to Jonathan, he suggested that Margaret might be selling some of her existing collection to finance new purchases, which would make sense given her divorce proceedings. I accepted this explanation, though something about Margaret's evasiveness continued to bother me. The second sign came 6 months later, when I realized that Margaret had stopped asking for my professional advice about her collection. Previously, she had sought my opinion about everything from authenticity questions to market values, but suddenly she seemed to be making decisions without consulting me. When I offered to help her with some pieces she mentioned wanting to sell, she declined, saying she had found a dealer who was handling everything for her. This struck me as odd, since she had always valued my expertise and had never hesitated to take advantage of my professional knowledge in the past. But I was dealing with my own challenges during this period: my mother's cancer diagnosis, treatment, and eventual death in late 2022, and I didn't have the emotional energy to worry about Margaret's mysterious new independence regarding her collection. My mother's death was devastating, not only because of the loss itself, but because it left me feeling completely disconnected from my family's history and heritage. My father had died when I was 15, and my mother's death made me the last link to my grandmother's stories and traditions. The ring became even more precious to me during this period, representing not just my family's legacy, but my mother's final gift and blessing. I wore it often, drawing comfort from the physical connection to the women who had shaped my identity and values. Margaret was wonderfully supportive during my mother's illness and after her death, offering practical help and emotional comfort in ways that made me feel truly grateful to be part of the Williams family. She attended the funeral, helped with arrangements, and seemed to understand the depth of my grief in ways that even Jonathan sometimes struggled with. "I know how much your family heritage means to you," Margaret had said during one of our conversations about my mother's death. "Your grandmother's ring must be even more precious now that it's your last connection to your mother's memory. Her understanding and compassion during that difficult time made me feel closer to Margaret than I had ever felt before. I began to think that perhaps my earlier concerns about her controlling tendencies had been unfair, and that grief was helping us both appreciate what really mattered in family relationships. What I didn't realize was that Margaret's increased attention to my emotional state and my attachment to the ring wasn't compassion, it was calculation. She was using my grief and vulnerability to gather information that would help her plan what would become the most devastating betrayal I had ever experienced. The foundation for that betrayal had been carefully laid over 3 years of building trust, gathering information, and positioning herself as someone who understood and valued my family's history. By the time I discovered what Margaret had done, the damage would be complete, but so would my determination to make her pay for every moment of deception and every dollar of theft. The discovery that would change everything happened on Thursday, December 7th, 2023, during what was supposed to be a routine visit to help Margaret prepare for her annual Christmas party. I had driven to her house in Buckhead after work, carrying a bottle of her favorite wine and looking forward to an evening of holiday planning and the kind of mother-daughter bonding that had become more common since my own mother's death. Margaret greeted me at the door wearing a stunning new necklace that immediately caught my professional eye, a vintage Art Deco piece with emeralds and diamonds that would have cost at least $15,000 at auction. When I complimented her on it, her response was evasive in a way that triggered my professional instincts. "Oh, this old thing? I've had it for ages," she said, her hand moving unconsciously to cover the necklace. "I probably should wear my nice pieces more often instead of saving them for special occasions." But I knew Margaret's collection well after 3 years of helping her with appraisals and purchases, and I had never seen this necklace before. More concerning was her obvious discomfort with my notice, which was completely unlike her usual eagerness to discuss her acquisitions and their histories. We spent the first hour reviewing plans for the Christmas party, discussing menu options and guest lists while I tried to shake off my unease about the necklace. Margaret seemed distracted and nervous, checking her phone frequently and avoiding eye contact in ways that felt unusual and uncomfortable. "I need to run upstairs for a moment to grab something," Margaret said around 8 p.m. "Would you mind starting on the appetizer list? I'll be right back." Left alone in Margaret's living room, I found myself studying the display of jewelry and art pieces that had caught my attention over recent months. The collection had definitely expanded and upgraded significantly, and every piece I examined showed the kind of quality and craftsmanship that commanded high prices in the luxury market. But it was what I didn't see that made my stomach drop with a cold dread that I initially couldn't explain. Margaret's collection had always included several pieces that I had helped her appraise or authenticate: a Victorian brooch, an Edwardian pendant, a 1930s cocktail ring, and those familiar pieces were nowhere to be seen. More troubling was the absence of a distinctive Georgian silver tea set that had been prominently displayed in Margaret's dining room. For as long as I had known her, the set had been a wedding gift from Jonathan's paternal grandmother, and Margaret had always spoken about it with particular pride and affection. When Margaret returned downstairs 20 minutes later, she seemed even more agitated than before, and her attempts at normal conversation felt forced and artificial. "Margaret," I said carefully, "I noticed that your grandmother's tea set isn't in the dining room anymore. Did you move it somewhere else?" The color drained from her face, and for a moment she looked genuinely panicked before recovering her composure. "Oh yes, I had it cleaned, and it's still at the jeweler's. You know how tarnished silver can get." The explanation sounded reasonable, but something about her delivery made me suspicious. Margaret had always been meticulous about the care of her silver, and I had never known her to take pieces to a jeweler for cleaning when she had always managed that maintenance herself. "Which jeweler are you using?" I asked, my professional curiosity now fully engaged. I might have some pieces that need attention too. Margaret's pause was just a heartbeat too long. "Oh, it's just a little shop downtown. I don't remember the name off the top of my head." The evasion was so unlike Margaret's usual precision about details that I knew something was seriously wrong. But before I could ask follow-up questions, she changed the subject to Christmas cookie recipes and maintained determinedly cheerful conversation for the rest of my visit. I drove home feeling unsettled and confused. unable to shake the feeling that Margaret was hiding something significant. When I mentioned my concerns to Jonathan, he suggested that his mother might be feeling stress about hosting her first Christmas party since the divorce, and that I was probably reading too much into her distracted behavior. But over the next few days, I found myself thinking obsessively about the missing pieces from Margaret's collection and her obvious discomfort with my questions. My professional training had taught me to trust my instincts about authenticity and provenance, and every instinct I had was telling me that something was very wrong. The revelation came accidentally on Sunday, December 10th, when I was browsing through the online catalog for Mitchell & Associates, an upscale auction house that specialized in estate jewelry and antiques. I was looking for pieces similar to items I was appraising for work when I saw something that made my blood freeze in my veins. Listed in the recently sold section was a photograph of my grandmother's Cartier engagement ring, described as Art Deco diamond ring, Cartier, circa 1925, and showing a sale price of $45,000. The sale date was November 15th, 2023. Exactly 3 weeks earlier, I stared at the screen for several minutes, certain that I was mistaking another ring for my grandmother's, but every detail was unmistakably familiar. The distinctive platinum setting, the precise cut of the central diamond, the delicate millgrain work around the smaller stones. It was definitely, unquestionably my ring, but according to the auction listing, the ring had been consigned by estate of Margaret Williams and had been sold to a private collector in Florida. The consignment paperwork, visible in the detailed listing, showed Margaret's signature and contact information, along with a notarized statement claiming ownership of the piece. My hands were shaking as I called the auction house, using my professional credentials to request additional information about the consignment. The records showed that Margaret had brought the ring to them in early November, claiming it was part of her collection that she was selling to fund her post-divorce lifestyle. The consignor provided excellent documentation, the auction house representative told me. She had photographs of herself wearing the piece at various social events, and she was very knowledgeable about its history and provenance. The photographs they described made me physically nauseous. Margaret had not only stolen my ring, she had created fake documentation to support her ownership claim and had posed for pictures wearing my family heirloom to strengthen her fraudulent consignment. When I asked about the current location of the ring, I learned that it had been purchased by Elena Rodriguez, a private collector in Miami who specialized in vintage Cartier pieces. The auction house provided her contact information, and when I called her that evening, I discovered that she had been looking for exactly this type of ring for over 2 years. It's absolutely exquisite, Elena told me. The seller seemed very knowledgeable about its history, and I was impressed by how well it had been cared for. I paid full price because pieces like this rarely come to market. During our conversation, I explained my situation and provided Elena with documentation proving my ownership of the ring, including photographs of my mother and grandmother wearing it, and inheritance paperwork from my mother's estate. Elena was horrified to learn that she had unknowingly purchased stolen property and immediately agreed to sell the ring back to me at cost. I had no idea it was stolen, she said. I feel terrible about being part of this, even unknowingly. I'll send you all the documentation I received from the auction house so you can pursue legal action against the person who defrauded both of us. The purchase price of $45,000 represented most of my savings, money I had been accumulating for the down payment on a larger house that Jonathan and I had been planning to buy. But recovering my grandmother's ring was worth any financial sacrifice, and I immediately arranged for the wire transfer. Over the next few days, I worked with Elena in the auction house to gather comprehensive documentation of Margaret's fraud. The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of Margaret wearing my ring at social events during the period when she claimed to own it, her fraudulent ownership statements, and most damning, security camera footage from the auction house showing Margaret personally delivering the ring for consignment. But as I assembled the evidence, I realized that this wasn't just about one stolen ring. The missing pieces from Margaret's collection, her recent acquisitions of expensive jewelry, her evasiveness about her financial situation, it all pointed to a pattern of theft and fraud that was much more extensive than I had initially understood. Margaret had been using her access to Jonathan's and my home, her knowledge of my work schedule, and her intimate familiarity with my most precious possessions to systematically steal and sell items that belonged to me. The ring was just the most valuable and emotionally significant piece in what appeared to be a comprehensive campaign of theft. The rage I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This wasn't just robbery. It was a calculated betrayal by someone who had used my grief over my mother's death to gather information about my most precious possessions and then profit from my emotional vulnerability. But Margaret had made a critical error in targeting someone with my professional background and connections. She had assumed that the quiet daughter-in-law, who rarely challenged her, would simply accept the loss and never discover what had happened. What she didn't realize was that my work in the auction and appraisal industry had given me both the knowledge and the resources to track stolen items and the legal expertise to pursue comprehensive remedies for theft and fraud. As I stared at the recovered ring in its velvet box that evening, I began planning not just how to expose Margaret's theft, but how to use the experience to launch a business venture that would transform my career and my financial future while serving Margaret the most perfectly orchestrated public humiliation imaginable. Christmas dinner at Margaret's house was just 2 weeks away, and I was going to make sure it was a holiday that no one in the Williams family would ever forget. The 2 weeks between recovering my grandmother's ring and Christmas dinner became the most intensely focused period of my life, as I planned what would appear to be a family celebration while actually orchestrating the most comprehensive exposure of theft and fraud I could devise. Every detail had to be perfect, from the timing of my revelations to the documentation I would present, because I knew I would only get one chance to destroy Margaret's reputation while protecting my own credibility. My first step was consulting with Elena Rodriguez, the collector who had unknowingly purchased my stolen ring. Elena had been so disturbed by her inadvertent role in Margaret's fraud that she offered to help me gather additional evidence and pursue legal remedies. Isabella, what your mother-in-law did isn't just theft, it's sophisticated fraud that required planning and deliberate deception, Elena told me during one of our phone conversations. The fake documentation she provided and the photographs of herself wearing your ring show this was a calculated scheme, not an impulsive mistake. Elena connected me with Marcus Chen, a private investigator who specialized in art and jewelry theft, and Patricia Morrison, an attorney who focused on cases involving stolen antiques and fraud within families. Both professionals were fascinated by the sophistication of Margaret's deception and eager to help me build a comprehensive case. Marcus's investigation revealed that Margaret had been involved in questionable sales for over 18 months, always dealing with different auction houses and consignment shops to avoid creating a pattern that might trigger suspicion. The stolen Georgian silver tea set had been sold to an estate dealer in Savannah for $8,000, and several pieces of jewelry that I remembered from my early visits to Margaret's house had been sold through various Atlanta dealers. Your mother-in-law has generated approximately $85,000 in sales over the past 18 months. Marcus told me after completing his preliminary investigation. The documentation suggests she's been systematically targeting high-value items that could be sold without immediately obvious ownership. Disputes. Patricia Morrison's legal analysis was even more damning. Margaret's creation of fake ownership documentation and her posing for photographs with stolen items elevates this from simple theft to conspiracy to commit fraud, Patricia explained. She could face both criminal charges and civil liability that could include punitive damages. But while I was building my legal case, I was also developing a business strategy that would transform this devastating experience into the foundation for my own entrepreneurial success. My work in the auction industry had given me deep knowledge of the market for estate jewelry and antiques, and my recent experience as a victim of theft had highlighted a significant gap in the security and authentication services available to collectors. I began developing a business plan for Provenance Verified, a company that would provide comprehensive authentication, security, and insurance services for collectors of vintage jewelry and antiques. The business would combine my expertise in appraisal and art history with cutting-edge technology for tracking and verifying ownership of valuable items. Elena Rodriguez became my first business partner, providing both startup capital and connections within the collecting community. There's a huge market for the services you're proposing, Elena told me. Collectors are constantly worried about authenticity and theft, but the current solutions are fragmented and incomplete. By December 20th, I had assembled everything I needed for the Christmas dinner confrontation: comprehensive documentation of Margaret's thefts, evidence of her fraudulent sales practices, legal papers for both criminal and civil proceedings, and a business plan that would allow me to transform my victimization into entrepreneurial success. But I also had a more personal agenda. Jonathan needed to see his mother's true character, and the rest of the Williams family needed to understand that Margaret's theft hadn't just targeted me personally. It had violated the trust and heritage of everyone who had welcomed her into their lives. Christmas dinner at Margaret's house was always an elaborate affair, with her extended family, including Jonathan's aunts, uncles, and cousins, gathering for a meal that showcased Margaret's skills as a hostess and her beautiful home. This year's guest list included 14 people, providing exactly the kind of audience I wanted for Margaret's public exposure. I spent Christmas morning wrapping my gift to Margaret, a beautifully presented box containing the original receipt for my grandmother's ring purchase, the auction house documentation of its sale, photographs of Margaret wearing the stolen ring, and a comprehensive legal summary of her fraudulent activities prepared by Patricia Morrison. Jonathan and I arrived at Margaret's house at 2 p.m., carrying our traditional contributions to the dinner along with my carefully prepared surprise. Margaret greeted us at the door wearing yet another new piece of jewelry, a stunning ruby and diamond bracelet that I estimated was worth at least $20,000. "Isabella, darling," Margaret said, embracing me with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "You look absolutely beautiful. Is that a new necklace?" I was wearing a simple gold chain with a small pendant, nothing that could compete with Margaret's increasingly elaborate jewelry displays. "Just something I picked up recently," I replied, marveling at her ability to maintain such perfect composure while knowing she had robbed me of my most precious possession. The family gathering proceeded normally for the first 2 hours, with traditional Christmas conversations about work, travel plans, and family news. Margaret was at her charming best, entertaining everyone with stories and ensuring that every guest felt welcomed and appreciated. But I was watching for signs of the stress and guilt that Margaret must have been feeling, and I caught subtle indicators that she wasn't as comfortable as she appeared. She avoided direct eye contact with me during conversations, seemed nervous when people complimented her jewelry, and checked her phone frequently in ways that suggested anxiety rather than normal social media engagement. The moment I had been waiting for came when Margaret began the gift exchange, a traditional part of the Williams family Christmas celebration. She had always prided herself on choosing thoughtful, personal gifts that demonstrated her attention to each family member's interests and needs. "Isabella," Margaret said, presenting me with an elegantly wrapped box. "I saw this and thought of you immediately. I hope you love it as much as I enjoyed choosing it." Inside the box was a vintage-style pendant necklace, clearly expensive and beautiful, but obviously meant to replace the connection to my family heritage that Margaret knew she had stolen. The gesture was so calculated and cruel that I felt my carefully controlled composure begin to crack. "Thank you, Margaret," I said, my voice steady despite the rage building inside me. "It's beautiful, and actually, I have something for you too." I retrieved my own carefully wrapped box and presented it to Margaret with a smile that I hoped conveyed the appropriate level of holiday warmth. "This is something I put together specifically for you, based on your interests in vintage jewelry and family history." Margaret opened the box with obvious anticipation, and I watched her face carefully as she processed what she was seeing. The auction house receipt was on top, clearly showing the sale of Estate of Margaret Williams Art Deco diamond ring, Cartier, circa 1925, for $45,000. Her expression shifted from confusion to recognition to panic in a matter of seconds, and I saw her hand tremble as she lifted the receipt to see the photographs and legal documents underneath. "I don't understand," she said quietly, her voice lacking its usual confidence. What is this? It's documentation of your theft and sale of my grandmother's engagement ring, I replied calmly, making sure my voice carried clearly to everyone in the room. Along with evidence of your systematic theft of family heirlooms and your creation of fraudulent ownership documentation. The silence that followed was absolute. Every conversation in the room stopped as family members realized that something significant was happening, though most of them didn't yet understand the implications of what they were witnessing. Jonathan moved closer to see what was in the box, and I watched his face change as he processed the evidence of his mother's crimes. "Mom, what is this about?" he asked, his voice strained with confusion and growing concern. Margaret attempted to regain control of the situation. "There's been some kind of misunderstanding," she said, forcing a laugh that sounded artificial and desperate. "Isabella, I think you've gotten confused about something." "There's no confusion," I interrupted, standing up and addressing the entire room. "Margaret stole my grandmother's engagement ring from our home, created fake ownership documentation, and sold it at auction for $45,000. She's also been stealing and selling other family heirlooms for over 18 months. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and questions, but I continued speaking, determined to ensure that everyone understood the full scope of Margaret's deception. I've spent the past 2 weeks working with investigators and attorneys to document Margaret's theft and fraud. The evidence is comprehensive and includes security camera footage of her delivering stolen items to auction houses, fake ownership statements notarized with forged signatures, and photographs of her wearing my family's jewelry at social events while claiming it belonged to her. Margaret made one final attempt at denial. "This is ridiculous. Isabella is obviously upset about something, and she's making false accusations." "The accusations aren't false," I said, pulling out additional documentation. "Here's the receipt showing where I had to buy back my own ring for $45,000. Here are the photographs you posed for while wearing my stolen jewelry. Here's the legal analysis showing that your actions constitute multiple felonies." The impact of this revelation on Jonathan was immediate and devastating. He stared at his mother with an expression of shock and disgust that I had never seen before, and when he spoke, his voice was barely controlled. "Mom, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't steal Isabella's grandmother's ring." Margaret's composure finally cracked completely. "Jonathan, you don't understand the pressure I've been under since the divorce. I needed money to maintain my lifestyle, and I thought Isabella wouldn't notice if one piece went missing." "You thought I wouldn't notice that my grandmother's engagement ring was missing?" I asked incredulously. "The ring my mother gave me on her deathbed? The last connection I have to my family's heritage?" The rest of the family was now fully engaged in the conversation, asking questions and expressing shock at what they were learning about Margaret's activities. Jonathan's Aunt Carol spoke for many of them when she said, "Margaret, how could you do something like this to Isabella? How could you steal from your own daughter-in-law?" Margaret tried several different explanations and justifications over the next 20 minutes, but each attempt only made her look worse as more details of her deception became clear. Finally, she seemed to realize that the situation was beyond repair. "I think it's time for everyone to leave," she said, her voice shaking with anger and humiliation. "This Christmas dinner is over." "Actually," I said, gathering my documentation and preparing to leave, "I have one more gift for you. Margaret." I handed her a final envelope containing a summons for both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit seeking damages for theft, fraud, and emotional distress. "Merry Christmas. You'll be hearing from my attorney in the new year." As Jonathan and I left Margaret's house that evening, followed by most of the other family members who had lost all appetite for continuing the celebration, I felt a satisfaction that was deeper than simple revenge. Margaret's theft had cost her the respect of her entire family, her reputation in Atlanta's social circles, and potentially her freedom if the criminal charges resulted in conviction. But more importantly, her betrayal had given me the motivation and the evidence I needed to launch a business that would transform my career and my financial future while helping other collectors protect themselves from exactly the kind of sophisticated theft and fraud that Margaret had perpetrated against me. 3 months after the Christmas dinner that exposed Margaret's crimes, I was sitting in the renovated warehouse space in Atlanta's Arts District that would become the headquarters of Provenance Verified, surrounded by state-of-the-art security equipment, authentication technology, and the kind of sophisticated inventory management systems that would revolutionize how collectors protected and tracked their valuable items. The transformation had been swift and comprehensive. The publicity from Margaret's case had attracted attention from collectors, law enforcement agencies, and insurance companies who were all interested in the authentication and security services that my company was developing. More importantly, the legal proceedings against Margaret had established my credibility as someone who could uncover and prosecute sophisticated fraud schemes. Elena Rodriguez had become my business partner and primary investor, contributing $500,000 in startup capital along with her extensive network of collectors and dealers. Isabella, what you've created here addresses every major concern that serious collectors have, Elena told me during one of our planning sessions. Authentication, provenance verification, secure storage, insurance documentation. It's a comprehensive solution that doesn't exist anywhere else. The business model was brilliant in its simplicity. Provenance Verified would serve as a combination authenticator, secure storage facility, and insurance service for collectors of vintage jewelry, art, and antiques. Each item would be photographed, scientifically analyzed, and assigned a unique digital identifier that would be maintained in a blockchain-based database. Clients could access their collections through a secure online portal and receive immediate alerts if any piece was reported stolen or offered for sale without authorization. But the most innovative aspect of our service was the integration with law enforcement and auction houses. We had developed partnerships with major auction companies, estate dealers, and police departments that would automatically flag any item in our database if it appeared in their systems. This meant that if someone tried to sell a stolen piece, we would know about it within hours rather than discovering the theft months or years later. The Margaret Williams case had become our primary marketing tool, demonstrating exactly why collectors needed comprehensive protection and how our services could prevent the kind of systematic theft that had targeted me. The media coverage had been extensive, with features in Town & Country, Architectural Digest, and Robb Report highlighting both the sophistication of Margaret's fraud and the innovative solutions that Provenance Verified was offering to prevent similar crimes. My first major client was Dr. Patricia Chen, a prominent Atlanta surgeon who had inherited a substantial collection of Asian art and jewelry from her grandmother. After reading about what happened to you, I realized how vulnerable my collection was, Dr. Chen told me during our initial consultation. I have pieces worth over $2 million, and I had no systematic way of documenting their provenance or protecting them from theft. Dr. Chen's collection became our showcase project, demonstrating how our authentication and security services could provide peace of mind for collectors, while also increasing the insurance and resale value of their items. The comprehensive documentation we provided increased the insurance value of her collection by 30% and made several pieces significantly more attractive to potential buyers because of their verified provenance. Within 6 months, Provenance Verified had secured 43 clients with combined collections valued at over $50 million. Our revenue model included initial authentication fees, ongoing storage and monitoring charges, and insurance commissions that generated substantial recurring income. The business was already profitable and projected to reach $3 million in annual revenue within 18 months. But while my business was thriving, Margaret's life had collapsed completely. The criminal charges against her had resulted in a plea agreement that included 18 months of probation, community service, and restitution of $127,000 covering all the items she had stolen and sold. The civil lawsuit had been settled for an additional $200,000 in punitive damages and attorney fees. More devastating than the financial consequences were the social and reputational costs of her exposure. Atlanta's social circles had thoroughly rejected Margaret once the details of her theft became public, and she had been forced to sell her Buckhead house and move to a modest apartment in a less prestigious part of the city. Margaret has become completely persona non grata. Jonathan's Aunt Carol told me during a family gathering 6 months after the Christmas dinner confrontation. Nobody wants to be associated with someone who would steal from her own daughter-in-law's family heritage. It's the kind of betrayal that people never forget or forgive. Margaret's attempts to rebuild her social connections had been unsuccessful, partly because the story of her theft had been covered extensively in local media, but primarily because the nature of her crime. Stealing a family heirloom from a grieving daughter-in-law was viewed as particularly cruel and calculating by people who might have been willing to overlook other types of financial difficulties. The impact on my relationship with Jonathan had been profound but ultimately strengthening. Seeing his mother's true character had been devastating for him, but it had also freed him from the lifelong pattern of trying to please her at the expense of our marriage. I feel like I've been living in denial about who my mother really is. Jonathan told me during one of our conversations about the situation. I always knew she could be manipulative and controlling, but I never imagined she was capable of something this cruel and calculated. Jonathan's relationship with Margaret had been permanently damaged by her theft and the lies she had told to cover it up. He continued to have minimal contact with her, primarily to ensure she was meeting the terms of her probation, but he had made it clear that rebuilding trust would require genuine accountability and behavior change that Margaret seemed incapable of providing. "She still acts like she's the victim in all this," Jonathan said after a particularly frustrating phone call with his mother. "She keeps saying that you overreacted and that the family should have been more understanding of the pressure she was under. She doesn't seem to understand that stealing your grandmother's ring wasn't just theft. It was a betrayal of everything family is supposed to represent. The professional recognition I was receiving had been equally transformative. I had been invited to speak at conferences for collectors, law enforcement agencies, and insurance companies about preventing art and jewelry theft. My expertise in authentication and fraud detection had made me a sought-after consultant for law firms handling cases involving stolen antiques and disputed provenance. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution had featured me in their 40 Under 40 Business Leaders list, and Southern Living had profiled Provenance Verified as one of the South's most innovative new companies. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the International Association of Appraisers, which had awarded me their Innovation in Authentication award for developing new technologies and methodologies for verifying provenance. One case that particularly demonstrated the value of our services involved Isabella Martinez, a widow whose late husband's extensive watch collection had been systematically stolen by their son over a period of 2 years. Using our authentication database and law enforcement partnerships, we were able to identify and recover 14 watches worth over $400,000 that had been sold to dealers across 3 states. Without provenance verified, I never would have known that my son was stealing from me, Rebecca told a reporter during a feature story about our company. Isabella's system identified the thefts within hours of the watches appearing at auction houses, and her law enforcement connections helped me recover pieces that I thought were gone forever. The success of cases like Rebecca's had attracted attention from insurance companies who were interested in partnering with us to provide theft prevention and recovery services for their high-value clients. We had signed agreements with 3 major insurers that would refer clients to us and offer premium discounts for collections protected by our services. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my success was the knowledge that Margaret's betrayal had ultimately given me everything I needed to build a business that was more successful and fulfilling than any career I could have achieved. Without her inadvertent motivation, the woman who had thought she could steal my family's heritage and profit from my grief had actually provided the inspiration and credibility for building a company that would protect thousands of other collectors from exactly the kind of sophisticated theft she had perpetrated against me. My grandmother's ring, which had been the centerpiece of Margaret's theft, now occupied a place of honor in my office, displayed in a custom case that represented both my family's legacy and the business empire that had grown from protecting that legacy. Every client who visited our offices could see the ring and hear the story of how a mother-in-law's betrayal had become the foundation for a revolution in how valuable collections were authenticated, protected, and preserved. The student had not just become the teacher, she had become the authority, and the thief who had tried to profit from her family's history had become the cautionary tale that helped build a multi-million-dollar business dedicated to preventing exactly the kind of crime she had committed. 1 year after the Christmas dinner that exposed Margaret's crimes, I stood in the ballroom of the Atlanta History Center, wearing a custom-designed emerald green gown that cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, accepting the Georgia Small Business Administration's Entrepreneur of the Year Award for the dramatic success of Provenance Verified. The audience of 400 business leaders and dignitaries gave me a standing ovation as I approached the podium. But what made the moment truly perfect was seeing Margaret herself in the back of the room, working as a server for the catering company handling the event. The transformation of my life had been complete and overwhelming. Provenance Verified now employed 23 people across offices in Atlanta, Charleston, and Nashville, with annual revenue approaching $8 million and a client roster that included Fortune 500 executives, entertainment industry figures, and old money Southern families whose collections required the highest levels of authentication and security. 18 months ago, I began my acceptance speech. Looking out at the audience while carefully avoiding eye contact with Margaret, I was the victim of a sophisticated theft that could have destroyed my connection to my family's heritage forever. Tonight I stand before you as the CEO of a company that has prevented over $50 million worth of similar thefts and helped law enforcement recover stolen items in cases across 12 states. The presentation that followed detailed how Provenance Verified had revolutionized the authentication and security industry. But what I didn't share with the audience was the personal satisfaction of knowing that Margaret was listening to every word while serving hors d'oeuvres to the same social circles that had once welcomed her as a peer. The business success had exceeded even my most optimistic projections. Our authentication services were now used by 3 major auction houses as their primary verification system, and our secure storage facilities were operating at capacity with waiting lists for new clients. The blockchain-based tracking system we had developed was being licensed to institutions worldwide, generating substantial royalty income on top of our core service revenues. But perhaps more importantly, we had become the leading authority on preventing and investigating art and jewelry theft, with law enforcement agencies regularly consulting our database and expertise for cases involving stolen cultural artifacts and family heirlooms. One case that had brought us national attention involved the recovery of a Monet painting that had been stolen from a private collection in Palm Beach and offered for sale through a network of dealers in New York, Los Angeles, and London. Using our international partnerships and database systems, we had tracked the painting's movement through the black market and provided evidence that led to the arrest of 7 people involved in the theft ring. Provenance Verified's investigation was crucial to breaking up an international art theft operation. FBI Special Agent Michael Rodriguez had told CNN during their coverage of the case, "Their technology and expertise are changing how we approach these crimes and how we protect cultural heritage." The recognition had led to consulting contracts with museums, government agencies, and international law enforcement organizations that were eager to implement our methodologies for protecting and tracking valuable cultural artifacts. My personal life had been equally transformed. Jonathan and I had purchased a historic mansion in Atlanta's Inman Park neighborhood, complete with climate-controlled rooms for displaying my expanding collection of authenticated vintage jewelry and art. The house had been featured in Southern, living as an example of how modern security technology could be seamlessly integrated into historic architecture. More significantly, Jonathan had proposed 6 months earlier with a custom-designed ring that incorporated stones from my grandmother's original Cartier piece, creating a new family heirloom that honored my heritage while symbolizing our future together. The wedding was planned for the following spring, and Margaret would not be invited. "I want our marriage to be built on the foundation of respect and honesty that your family represents," Jonathan had said when he proposed, "not the manipulation and deceit that characterized my mother's approach to relationships." Jonathan's relationship with Margaret remained minimal and strained. He fulfilled his basic obligations as her son, ensuring she had adequate housing and basic necessities. But he had made it clear that rebuilding any meaningful relationship would require genuine accountability and behavior change that Margaret seemed incapable of providing. She still doesn't understand that what she did was fundamentally wrong, Jonathan told me after one of his brief monthly check-ins with his mother. She talks about it like it was a temporary lapse in judgment rather than a systematic betrayal of everything family is supposed to represent. Margaret's attempts to apologize and seek forgiveness had been consistently unsuccessful because they focused on minimizing her actions rather than taking full responsibility for the systematic nature of her theft and deception. Her letters and messages consistently portrayed her as a victim of circumstances rather than the architect of a calculated fraud scheme. The social consequences for Margaret had been severe and permanent. Atlanta's business and social communities had thoroughly rejected her once the details of her theft became public, and her attempts to rebuild her reputation had been unsuccessful. The catering job she had taken was the best employment she had been able to find after being terminated from her previous position when her criminal conviction became known. Nobody wants to hire someone who was convicted of stealing from family members. Jonathan's Aunt Carol had explained when I asked about Margaret's employment struggles. If she's willing to betray her own daughter-in-law, employers assume she can't be trusted with anything valuable or confidential. But the most satisfying aspect of Margaret's downfall was that it had been entirely self-inflicted. Every consequence she was experiencing was the direct result of her decision to steal my family's heritage and profit from my grief. She had chosen to betray someone who had the knowledge, resources, and determination to uncover her deception and hold her accountable for every aspect of her fraud. The evening's award ceremony concluded with a reception where I was approached by dozens of potential clients, business partners, and media representatives who wanted to learn more about Provenance Verified's services and expansion plans. But the moment that provided the most personal satisfaction came when Margaret approached me during a quiet moment near the end of the event. "Isabella," she said quietly, her voice lacking the confidence and authority that had once characterized her interactions with me, "I wanted to congratulate you on your success. You've built something remarkable." I looked at the woman who had once stolen my most precious possession and tried to profit from my grief, now reduced to serving appetizers at events hosted by the social circles that had once welcomed her as a peer. "Thank you, Margaret," I replied calmly. "I couldn't have done it without the inspiration you provided." She looked confused by my response, and I realized that she still didn't understand how completely her betrayal had backfired, or how instrumental her theft had been in launching my business empire. "I hope someday you can forgive me for the mistakes I made." Margaret continued, "I never meant to hurt you the way I did." "You didn't make mistakes, Margaret," I replied, my voice steady but firm. "You made choices. You chose to steal my family's heritage. You chose to create fraudulent documentation. You chose to profit from my grief. Those weren't errors in judgment. They were calculated decisions that revealed exactly who you are as a person." Margaret's expression shifted from hopeful to defensive. "I was under tremendous financial pressure after my divorce. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were thinking clearly enough to research the value of my grandmother's ring, create fake ownership documents, and pose for photographs to strengthen your fraud," I interrupted. "That level of planning and deception doesn't happen during moments of poor judgment. It requires sustained effort and deliberate cruelty." I paused, looking at this woman who had once had the power to make me feel small and unwelcome in my own family, and felt only pity for what she had become through her own choices. "But I want you to know that I'm grateful for what you did," I continued. "Your theft gave me the motivation and credibility to build a business that's more successful than anything I could have achieved without your betrayal. You thought you were stealing my heritage, but you actually gave me the foundation for creating something much more valuable." Margaret stared at me with an expression that suggested she was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her miscalculation. The quiet daughter-in-law she had thought she could manipulate and victimize had become one of Atlanta's most successful entrepreneurs, while her own life had been reduced to serving hors d'oeuvres at events celebrating other people's achievements. "I have to get back to work," Margaret said finally, her voice barely audible. "Of course," I replied. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." As I watched Margaret return to her serving duties, I reflected on the complete reversal of our positions. The woman who had once commanded respect in Atlanta's social circles was now working minimum-wage jobs and living in subsidized housing, while the daughter-in-law she had dismissed and victimized was being celebrated as one of the city's most innovative business leaders. But more importantly, Margaret's betrayal had taught me that the most powerful response to theft isn't just recovery, it's transformation. She had tried to steal my past, but instead she had given me the motivation to build a future that was more successful and meaningful than anything I could have achieved while remaining trapped. In her web of manipulation and control, the grandmother's ring that had been the centerpiece of Margaret's theft now sat in a place of honor in my office, representing not just my family's legacy, but the empire that had grown from protecting that legacy. Every client who saw the ring heard the story of how a mother-in-law's betrayal had become the foundation for a revolution in authentication and security services. Margaret had thought she could profit from my heritage, but instead she had provided the inspiration for building a business that would preserve and protect the heritage of thousands of families for generations to come. 3 years after the Christmas dinner that changed everything, I stood in the Smithsonian Institution's Museum of American History in Washington, D.C., delivering the keynote address at the International Conference on Cultural Heritage Protection. The audience of 200 included museum directors, law enforcement officials, government representatives from 30 countries, and private collectors who had traveled from around the world to learn about the authentication and security innovations that Provenance Verified had pioneered. 5 years ago, I began, looking out at the distinguished audience. I was a victim of sophisticated theft that could have ended my connection to my family's heritage forever. Today, I stand before you as the CEO of a company that has prevented over $500 million in cultural heritage, theft, and helped recover stolen artifacts in cases spanning 6 continents. The transformation had been complete and extraordinary. Provenance Verified was now valued at $50 million and operated in 12 countries, with offices in London, Paris, Tokyo, and Sydney. Our authentication technologies were used by major museums worldwide, and our blockchain-based tracking system had become the international standard for verifying the provenance of cultural artifacts and valuable collections. The business had evolved far beyond its original focus on individual collectors to become a comprehensive solution for governments, institutions, and organizations seeking to protect cultural heritage from theft, fraud, and illicit trafficking. We had helped UNESCO develop new protocols for tracking cultural artifacts, worked with Interpol to create international databases of stolen art, and provided consulting services to governments developing legislation to protect their cultural heritage. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of our success was the impact we were having on families like mine, who had been victimized by sophisticated theft schemes and needed both recovery, services, and long-term protection for their precious heirlooms. One case that exemplified our mission involved the Martinez family from New Mexico, whose collection of Native American artifacts had been systematically stolen and sold by a trusted family friend over a period of 3 years. Using our investigation techniques and international partnerships, we had tracked the stolen pieces to dealers and collectors in 7 different countries and recovered artifacts worth over $2 million. Provenance Verified didn't just help us recover our stolen heritage, Maria Martinez had told CBS News during their feature story about our company. They gave us the tools and knowledge to protect our collection for future generations and to share our cultural history with the world in ways we never thought possible. The recognition had been overwhelming and gratifying. I had been named to Forbes' 30 Under 30 list in the Art and Style category, featured on the cover of Art News as the woman revolutionizing art security, and invited to speak at conferences, universities, and government agencies around the world about cultural heritage protection. But the personal transformation had been equally significant. My marriage to Jonathan had been stronger and more fulfilling than I could have imagined, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that had been tested and strengthened by the challenges we had faced together. Our first child, Elena Isabella Williams had been born 8 months earlier and was named after both my grandmother Elena and the collector who had helped me recover my stolen ring. The nursery in our historic Atlanta home was decorated with carefully curated pieces from my authenticated collection, creating a space where our daughter would grow up surrounded by beauty, history, and stories of resilience and triumph. I want Elena to understand that our family's strength comes from our ability to overcome challenges and transform setbacks into opportunities. I had told Southern Living during their profile of our home and family, the heritage she's inheriting isn't just about the objects we've preserved. It's about the values and determination that have been passed down through generations of strong women. Jonathan had become my most trusted business advisor and had left his engineering position to serve as Chief Technology Officer for Provenance Verified, developing the software systems and security protocols that had made our international expansion possible. Working with Isabella has shown me what it means to build something meaningful. Jonathan had said during a recent interview about entrepreneurial couples, she took a devastating personal experience and transformed it into a business that protects cultural heritage for families around the world. That kind of vision and determination is incredibly inspiring. Margaret's life, by contrast, had continued its downward spiral. The criminal conviction and civil judgments had made it impossible for her to rebuild her previous lifestyle or social connections, and she was now living in a senior housing facility in suburban Atlanta, working part-time at a gift shop and struggling with health problems that seemed related to the stress and isolation of her situation. Jonathan maintained minimal contact with his mother, providing basic financial support and ensuring she had adequate medical care, but their relationship remained permanently damaged by her theft and her continued refusal to take full responsibility for her actions. She still talks about what she did like it was a momentary lapse in judgment, rather than a systematic betrayal. Jonathan told me after one of his quarterly visits with Margaret, she doesn't understand that trust, once broken in such a fundamental way, can't be rebuilt without genuine accountability and changed behavior. Margaret had made several attempts over the years to apologize and seek reconciliation, but her efforts consistently focused on her own suffering, rather than acknowledging the impact of her actions on our family and our relationship. The last communication I had received from her was a letter that arrived 6 months after Elena's birth. Isabella, I know I made terrible mistakes, but I hope the birth of your daughter will help you understand the importance of family forgiveness. I would love to be part of Elena's life and to share the family history that I know means so much to you. I had shown the letter to Dr. Patricia Morrison, a family therapist who had helped Jonathan and me process the trauma of Margaret's betrayal, and her analysis confirmed my instinct to maintain our boundaries. Margaret is still trying to manipulate the situation by using your daughter to gain access to your family, Dr. Morrison observed. She's not acknowledging the specific harm she caused or demonstrating any understanding of why trust needs to be rebuilt gradually through consistent behavior change. The decision to protect Elena from Margaret's influence had been easy, but it had also strengthened my determination to ensure that our daughter would grow up with a clear understanding of the values and principles that defined our family's identity. My grandmother's Cartier ring, which had been the centerpiece of Margaret's theft, now occupied a place of honor in a custom display case in our home's library, alongside documentation of its history and the story of its recovery. Elena would grow up knowing the story of how her mother had transformed theft into triumph and had built a business empire from the ashes of Betrayal, the international. Recognition had led to opportunities I could never have imagined when I was working as an appraiser at Whitmore & Associates. The French government had awarded me the Order of Arts and Letters for my contributions to cultural heritage protection, and the Italian Ministry of Culture had invited me to consult on their efforts to combat art trafficking. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from the Martinez Family Foundation, which had established the Isabella Williams Cultural Heritage Protection Scholarship for young women pursuing careers in art history, museum studies, and cultural preservation. Isabella's story proves that personal tragedy can become the foundation for protecting cultural heritage on a global scale. Elena Martinez had said during the scholarship announcement ceremony, her determination to transform her own victimization into tools for helping others represents the best of what cultural heritage protection can achieve. As I concluded my keynote address at the Smithsonian that morning, I shared the lesson that had become the foundation of both my business philosophy and my personal worldview. The people who try to steal our heritage often give us the greatest gift possible, the motivation to discover just how powerful we become when we refuse to accept victimization and choose instead to build something that protects not just ourselves, but countless others who face similar challenges. The standing ovation that followed lasted nearly 10 minutes, but what moved me most were the individuals who approached me afterward to share their own stories of theft, recovery, and transformation. Museum directors who had implemented our security protocols, law enforcement officers who had used our technologies to solve cases, and private collectors who had protected their family heritage using the tools we had developed. As I flew back to Atlanta that evening, I reflected on the complete transformation of my life and purpose since that December day when I discovered Margaret's theft. The quiet daughter-in-law who had been victimized by her mother-in-law's greed had become an internationally recognized authority on cultural heritage protection, building a business empire that was valued at $50 million and protected invaluable collections around the world. Margaret had thought she could steal my past and profit from my grief, but instead, she had given me the motivation to build a future that was more successful and meaningful than anything I could have achieved while remaining trapped. In her web of manipulation and control, the heritage she had tried to destroy had become the foundation for protecting heritage on a global scale, and the trust she had violated had been rebuilt into an international network of collectors, institutions, and governments working together to preserve cultural treasures for future generations. For any woman who has been betrayed by someone she trusted, who has had something precious stolen by people who were supposed to protect her, or who has been told that her heritage and values don't matter, I want you to know this. The most powerful response to theft is not just recovery, but transformation. Sometimes the greatest gift our enemies give us is the motivation to discover exactly how much we're capable of achieving when we refuse to remain victims and choose instead to become victors who protect others from the same harm we endured. Thank you for joining me on this journey from devastating betrayal to international success. If Isabella's story inspires you to protect your own heritage or pursue justice for wrongs committed against you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Please subscribe for more stories of women who transformed their darkest moments into their greatest triumphs. And remember, your heritage is worth protecting, your voice matters, and your determination to build something meaningful from life's challenges can change not just your own future, but the futures of countless others who need exactly the strength and wisdom that your experiences have given you. Sometimes the most precious treasures are the ones we build from the pieces of what others tried to destroy.